question to start with. So Yusek Halad, if I may, what are some of the challenges that COVID-19 has presented for disaster risk management in the Philippines? Over to you, sir.
Yeah, well, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed, number one, the current state of the Philippine public health system and how the system affects and interacts with all other systems. You mentioned earlier, Steve, about the World Risk Index. I recall that in 2018, we ranked number 3 among countries with the highest risk. And the focus in that World Risk Index then was access to health. So access to health service. So again, is emphasized here, demonstrated in this current pandemic. And its unprecedented complexity has tested the surge capacity of our public health systems and given us new perspective on pandemic response. I think we can all agree that this is true for many countries, not only for third world countries, but also first world countries with advanced health system. It also shows the interoperability between the public health system and all other systems. In the Philippines, one major reason for imposing lockdown or community quarantine is to hold the transmission as low as possible while allowing our health system to increase capacity. And those actions of imposing restrictions on the movement of people, however, impacted on our economy. So they are really interrelated. Another challenge, of course, is the handicap or restriction this pandemic dealt to our coordinations and actions. From our past experiences, we learned that the importance of logistics and supplies for a successful disaster response operations and humanitarian assistance actions. We encountered some difficulty with our supply chain and movement of logistics due to the general quarantine or the restriction of movement. And I would like to say that we hurdled those challenges thanks to the contribution of the private sector. Back to you, Steve.
Thank you so much, Yusek Halad. Veron, perhaps you'd like to comment on the same question, if I may.
Yes, indeed. COVID-19 has challenged our disaster risk management in all fronts. As far as response is concerned, delivery of essential services and humanitarian aid is greatly hampered due to limited mobility, both by the goods and the people, logistics, and access to community. All these, as well as ensuring safety of responders, have drastically also increased the cost of response. In the Philippines, where preparedness for natural hazards are in place, the challenge now is how to operationalize it with the presence of COVID-19. And lastly, there's the challenge of reopening economy in what they say as the next normal. It is imperative, therefore, that we work together to mitigate this threat. Over to you.
Absolutely. And Jaime, anything to add to this particular question?
No, absolutely. I think both Yusek Halad and Veron Gabaldon pointed out the interaction that has to take place when you have something of this magnitude. I think Yusek Halad used an important word. He used the word interrelated. And, there are some things in life that can only be tackled in a unified way, not only at the national level, but also at an international level. I don't think I've ever seen a situation like this that has involved so much of a need for all of us to interact together at both a national level and international level. It's been a complex issue because what started off as a health issue, of course, turned into both an economic and social one as well. I mean, the complexity of the after effects of something like this go well beyond health, as we all know. And making judgment calls on the range of different variables that come to affect a situation like this has been very complex and really necessitates for all of us to work together. I think you said, Halad said it very clearly, this is a time when all of us have to hold hands, see how we can coordinate and work together. And maybe the one area that Yusek Halad and Veronica did not mention is this has even moved into the whole area of education. Right now, we've had some hard lockdowns in the Philippines, but One area that's being affected, and of course will affect the young members, I guess, of our population, is the fact that many of them really are not allowed to go to school yet to prevent contact between them and the spread of the disease. This has had a tremendous effect on the way we teach. People are having to rethink through the infrastructure we need to get people to continue learning, and the list goes on. It's a wide-ranging grouping of variables, and as mentioned earlier, we've never seen such an interaction between all these different elements in the past. But maybe one last thought, Sebastian. I think people forget that in the Philippines, we just came from the explosion of Taal volcano just south of Manila. That started off at the beginning of this year before COVID-19 lockdown started. So we had a natural disaster, a volcano eruption. We're part of the Ring of Fire in the Philippines that started off creating quite a bit of problems in the southern part of Manila. Industries were affected and a whole range of different facilities, and then that was followed by COVID. So it added to a higher level of complexity in what we had to face here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaime. And I think absolutely what one would expect to hear, a strong call for collective action. And I know that that the Philippines has a particularly active typhoon season, and I can only hope that this year you are spared. But equally, I know that in the current climate, that may not be the case, and I'm delighted to see there's such a strong network and government response prepared to respond as required. Perhaps if I might ask a question slightly more specifically to each of you on your own areas of concern. So Yusek Khalad, may I ask, how does the private sector add value to what the government is doing? And how have government policies and practices enabled private sector contributions to potential natural hazards during the sort of COVID-19 era?
I think you're familiar, Sebastian, with one of our approaches in the Philippines disaster risk reduction management system, which is the whole of society approach. Wherein the private sector is a key player, and this whole of society approach is which we call locally as bayanihan, and is oftentimes depicted by an old and famous picture of a group of people lifting a house or bahay kubo to transfer it to a new location, and remove the key players there, a group of people from, and you can imagine that that will slow down their progress significantly. And that is the same with our DRRM system. The resource gaps in the disasters are filled in by the private sector and other actors through their capacity, inherent capacity, established networks within local government and communities. And the significant added value of the private sector and other actors is that they serve as valuable resource providers and force multipliers, especially in the gaps not provided, or in the resources not provided by the government. And these are integrated to the unified command system in managing the consequences of disasters. In the Philippines, the private sector, as a key player in the DRRM, organized themselves as one organization, and that is represented by Veron, the PDRF, and with as members Ayala corporations being led by Mr. Subeldi Ayala. And they even have an emergency operation center. This allows seamless coordination and effective sharing of information and data among their members and with other DRRM players, not only the government. Thus, the role of the private sector is shown here, not only as a participant, but as co-lead in effectively reducing the risk and managing its impact.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one might say you've moved from a fairly siloed response to a whole of government response, now to a whole of nation or a whole of society response, really incorporating all of the elements of civil society, the private sector, the government, and so on. Thank you very much indeed. Veron, may I turn to you and ask you a question more specific to the PDRF? And that is, how has coordination between the government, the UN, and the private sector, but also amongst private sector entities, changed since Typhoon Yolanda or Haiyan in 2013? And additionally, has COVID-19 impacted coordination efforts, and what's the implication on preparedness, response, and recovery?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Sebastian. I started my work in PDRF right after Super Typhoon Haiyan and implemented programs from response, recovery, rehabilitation for 5 years. And I can rightly say that there was significant improvement in the area of coordination, which actually puts into perspective the role of the private sector in DRR. And as mentioned by Yusek Halad, and this we are very happy to tell you that we now have a mechanism to work with the National Disaster Risk Reduction Management Council, led by Yusek Halad, and its member national agencies. And we have been invited and able to join policy dialogues as well. PDRF represents the private sector in the UN Humanitarian Country Team, and within our network, we have strengthened our capacity as a coordinating platform for the private sector. And through this platform, we were able to highlight the role of the private sector, not just as donors, but more importantly, harnessing their expertise and mobilizing their core business competencies in the areas of preparedness, response, recovery, and rehabilitation. With PDRF providing real-time situation reports and damage and needs assessment to our network, we are able to widen the reach through coordinated efforts. In terms of the impact of COVID, it definitely had an adverse impact on coordination. But when we work together, nothing is impossible. And when the government implemented community quarantine in Metro Manila in March, we immediately saw its impact to the vulnerable sector. And through the leadership of our co-chair, Jaime Augusto Zubel de Ayala, who is our panelist tonight or this morning, he made a call among business conglomerates to help the government and was able to raise $300 million in less than a week. And in partnership with Caritas Manila, we were able to quickly distribute grocery vouchers to 2.5 families or 2.5 million families or 12.7 million individuals. In terms of health, we also have extensive ongoing efforts to provide PPEs for our healthcare workers and have teamed up with Zwelling Pharma to take advantage of their global supply chain so we can compete with the global demand for PPEs. And finally, PDRF is involved in several public-private partnership task force focused on COVID response. Its work included increasing testing capacity, building up inventory of PPEs, improving supply chain management for laboratory supplies, designing thorough surveillance surveys, building data management system, among others. We also focused on economic recovery. The MSME resilience is one of the pillars of PDRF's program, the Philippine economy being made up of 99% MSME. And as early as March, we already conducted surveys among the MSME and monitor their status. Since then, we have conducted several webinars, developed tools and activities to reach out to them, and bring together experts and enablers from the government to help them make their businesses recover and responsive to the new normal. All of these are featured in our online platform we call SICA. This is a one-stop shop opportunity platform for MSME business recovery in partnership with CBI, UN OCHA, and UNDP. Quite a long response, but basically what I'm saying is that through coordination may be hampered, but we'll find a way. Over to you, Sebastian.
Thank you very much. If anything good came out of Yolanda, Haiyan, I remember standing in Tacloban and looking around at the incredible resilience of the Philippine people. It is networks like this. It's quite extraordinary to understand how much you've grown in a matter of 5-6 years. And I think the relative importance of these networks is becoming clearer and clearer. Our recent response in Vanuatu was in a pandemic environment in which we could not deploy teams, and really the only people we had to support those we were there to serve was the network in Vanuatu. So the relative importance is very, very clear. Jaime, if I may turn to you, may I ask what are the benefits for companies like the Ayala Corporation to work collectively through PDRF in addressing disasters?
No, absolutely. PDRF was formed back in 2009, and it was really, I think, a realization by many private sector companies that as a country that gets hit by natural disasters on a very regular basis, be they typhoons, earthquakes, volcanoes, and of course now pandemics, there was a need always to touch base with the government, coordinate, and I think, as Veron mentioned, there are a number of entities, utilities, and companies with different resources that are asked at different points in time to come and help out. We thought back in 2009 it would make sense to have a one touch point for groups like you, SEC, Halad, to touch base, and that we had to organize ourselves as a private sector. I think naturally we don't come together that often. Obviously, as separate entities, we have our own responsibilities, but there are moments of national need when it makes sense to coordinate and make life a little bit easier for the touch points in government. That's how we came together. And to be frank, a group like the Philippine Disaster Resilience Foundation is a neutral ground for all of these entities to come together. By building a staff around it, it's an easy place for us to convene, bring resources together, and frankly, build scale. I think for USEC, Halad, to be able to have one touch point and point out what he needs, and to have an entity that's already coordinated, has built trust, has an organization, and as USEC Halad pointed out, even has a 24/7 operation center, just makes life a lot easier. It's our way of contributing in an organized way to the national needs. But it goes well beyond that, Sebastian. I think a day doesn't go by when we don't convene and address a problem. Veronica knows this, that we don't learn from each other, build on skills that we have, contacts that we have. Problem solving as a team is much easier when you're a larger community. And the kind of problems we face now are so large that it goes beyond the needs of one entity or two. And finally, trust gets built over time, Sebastian. It doesn't get built overnight. And the fact that we have a working organization in PDRF has built a modicum of trust, a high degree of cooperation, coordination. We practice when times are quiet. We've found ways to work together, to learn, to have speakers come in. And finally, when the problems occur, there's already a good sense of trust, a coordination and communication, using a level of preparedness that takes already into account that communication channels that normally we can count on might not be there. So we're ready to address problems. And so when the problems do hit and individuals like USEC, Halad have to coordinate with all of us, then that sense of community, that sense of organization, that sense of knowing what each party brings to the table is already apparent and visible, just makes life a lot easier. So both at the intellectual level, at the sharing level, at the coordinating level, and at the scale level, Sebastian, so much comes from our joining a group like PDRF. It's been very satisfying and wonderful. I think maybe just to use one example, Sebastian, I think very recently, and it brings it all to light, different government entities decided to take up testing. It was important for the government to take testing procedures in the Philippines to a higher level. And there were phone calls made to PDRF, to a number of private sector entities. And very quickly, we formed something called T3, which was really to get testing facilities in the country to move up from a fairly low level of 2,000 a day to the agreed amount of about 30,000 a day. That was very quick coordination between the IATF, the operating teams in charge of organizing the government during COVID-19, the private sector, and a lot of it was really made so much easier by PDRF and the type of trust that had already been built by a number of different entities there. There's so many other projects, but I think we have kind of a unique model in the Philippines with the private sector organizing itself around an entity like PDRF. It's been a privilege and very, very useful.
As you said, the utility is very clear, and I particularly like your point on trust. I think building trust in this sort of endeavour is absolutely crucial. Colleagues, I don't at the moment see any questions in the chat box, and I just encourage those people who are online and listening, please do ask any questions that you'd like to of our three speakers. They're all enormously experienced. I don't think there's much they can't field. And while you're doing that, I'm going to ask a second round of questions. again, focusing perhaps a little bit more broadly. So Yusek Khalad, if I may, could I ask what are the crucial lessons, challenges learned from this pandemic, which we can use as a springboard to improve our current concept of a multi-stakeholder response to natural disasters, and how can the private sector help to address these challenges?
Yeah. Well, first off, back in 2016, when this job was offered to me, my initial reaction was to beg off. But while I gave myself 2 weeks decision-making period, and during that period I read about the multi-stakeholder and interagency approaches. It was also during the time that I read about the existence of PDRF. And well, back to that helped in making me decide to accept the job. That there are a lot of players that will help the government in solving problems on disaster risk reduction and management. And back to this pandemic experience shows that disaster response and management cannot be made by a single entity or select stakeholders alone. The essentiality of having a multi-stakeholder mechanism is thus underscored. It also brought about challenges and lessons learned on larger planning issues such as financing, data management and scenario projection and risk assessment, supply chain management, transportation and mobility planning, resource mobilization and early recovery planning. All these areas are highly crucial when it comes to disaster risk reduction and management. And I'd like to tell you that we got a lot of help from the private sector lately. Like, for example, developing the online platform for our supply chain management that came from the private sector. Another lesson to consider is to recognize the role of the locality and empower their governance through risk and evidence-based decision-making. The local chief executives, the mayors and the governors have power and exercise power and authority within their respective locality. It is therefore important that their exercise of that power and authority is risk-informed so that they are aligned with the policy of the national government. And while we are moving forward to all this, it must be emphasized that the foundation of an efficient disaster response lies with how well prepared our systems are. Half the battle is won if prevention and preparedness are prioritized. Our Defense Secretary, Secretary Lorenzana, who is also the chairperson of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, often lamented lately that for so many years we thought of procuring fighter jets and tanks or modernizing our weapon system. We realized later, thanks to COVID, that we should have modernized our hospitals first. And in our strategy to detect, isolate, and treat, we really got, in response to COVID, we really receive a lot of the support from the private sector. Let me highlight, for example, the conversion of facilities to be used as treatment or quarantine facilities, as well as putting up of mega swab tents for PCR tests. That got a lot of help from the private sector, from PDRF as well as Ayala. Thanks, sir, for your help. So we are now using those facilities here in Metro Manila and even the Philippine Arena in Bulacan and the Phil Investment in Muntinlupa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very clear that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that acting collaboratively and collectively, we can we can overcome some of these challenges. Now, I'm just seeing a couple of questions turn up in the chat box, and I'd be keen to answer people who are online. So perhaps if I could go, let me see. For Yusek Khalad, how do you see the PRDRF, well, actually, maybe not for Yusek Khalad. Let me see. The question is, how do you see PDRF complementing efforts. There would always be differences when working with governments, and how have you overcome this hurdle? So perhaps if I could ask Yusek Halad and then maybe Veron to comment on that.
Well, as I've said, the private sector very well is represented by PDRF in our disaster risk reduction management, especially in the phases wherein we need to do a lot of urgent actions during the disaster response phase. And with PDRF consolidating the efforts of the private sector from their member organizations, it takes a lot of tasks from us to coordinate with many players. It's with so many players in the disaster risk reduction management system. The council alone has 44 members, and we also have to deal with civil society organizations, and we really have, because of that interagency and multi-stakeholder approach, that means there are a lot of people chipping in and giving contributions to our efforts. Like, for example, lately, in our monitoring of donations for our COVID response, the private sector accounts for 65% of all the donors. That's about 1,000, almost 2,000 donors. So, and many of these were coordinated, orchestrated by PDRF. So, PDRF works as the counterpart of the Office of Civil Defense. Office of Civil Defense being the overall coordinator within the government. And since we only have one seat for the private sector in the council, that is already occupied way back in 2010, I think, when the council was established. Therefore, PDRF does not occupy a seat in the council. But at the same time, we have partnership. We established, we institutionalized this partnership with the Memorandum of Understanding, which we signed, I think, sometime in 2018. So that formalizes our engagement with PDRF, as well as with private sectors, big companies that they represent.
Thank you very much indeed. And just to be a little bit controversial, I'm going to change the question for Veron because I see more questions coming in. And this one is an interesting one for PDRF, and then I've got a question for Jaime. I see has just come in. When it comes, Veron, to collaboration, we can't focus on one sector alone. How do we know which response to prioritize, and what steps should we take before anything else? What's the first step to understand how to best prioritize?
Yeah, thank you. You know that the Philippines is composed of 7,100 islands, and we are often described as the supermall of natural hazards. So prioritizing is indeed a challenge for us, notwithstanding COVID. So number one is we built this emergency operations center where we can monitor all the hazards. We can assess the risks that our member companies face, the impact of emergencies, and from there, using using some protocols and guidelines, we look into prioritizing our response. So, but to be able to do that, first is that we acknowledge that the government is the lead, and our role is to support and augment in times of disaster. And second, we invested in preparedness. As we worked with the Office of Civil Defense as described by Yusek Halad. We worked with the UN, and as I mentioned, we built the Emergency Operations Center to be the central point for our coordination and collaboration across the stakeholders. And then thirdly, we shared our expertise. A lot of expertise, can be found in the private sector. And one particular expertise or best practice in the private sector is business continuity. And so we partnered with the Office of Civil Defense in co-developing the public sector version of the business continuity practice of the private sector or the business sector. So all those come into play and provide us with accurate information and which allows us to make decisions in terms of prioritization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Verona. Very clear and comprehensive answer. I have one for Jaime. I see that has come in related to education. Now, I'd note this is possibly not your area of particular expertise, but nevertheless, I think we should try to answer the question. The question was, you had mentioned, Jaime, that schools were still closed and will start only again online in late August. And coming from that, or stemming from that, the question was related to what are the lessons, the plans to accelerate access to technology for these children and students, especially in poor or remote areas, so that the COVID generation will not be left behind. Interested in your opinion. I very much accept this is not your particular area of expertise, but I'd be delighted to entertain your answer.
Actually, you're not quite right, Sebastian. Within our group, we're involved in both the educational sector and the delivery of telecommunication services as one of the private companies involved. So this is actually something that's very close to our heart, Sebastian. It is a challenge, but I think it would take a number of factors. Number one, I think we have to realize that online learning, communicating online is going to become a new reality for all of us. Here we are convening ourselves over 24 hours as a UN body of individuals. The same thing has to happen with schooling. Of course, there will always be a role for face-to-face teaching. It's important, and I'm a great believer in the kind of dynamic that comes when the students and a teacher are all put together. But at the same time, I think we have to prepare ourselves for a future where we can start to learn on an online basis. And I think all of us have a responsibility to lay down the infrastructure necessary for young students to be able to avail of that. In many ways, the telecommunication infrastructure in the country has expanded, but there are still remote areas that are not reached. I think to address that, I think we have to work hand in hand, both the private sector and the government, to find a solution to the last mile, particularly to hidden areas, and find ways to reach them. I think the role of government as well, I think Yusek Halad pointed it out, is to be complementary and to work hand in hand, and at the same time entice and encourage the private sector to fulfill certain national development requirements. But bringing them together and finding ways to work together to reach some of these more outlying areas, I think is a job that we can handle jointly together with the government if we set our minds to it, number one. Number two, I think teachers, Sebastian, need to be retrained. I think there's probably a little bit of insecurity about this shift to the online world. Teachers will probably feel, what is our role in teaching like this? We're used to a very different model. But I'm a great believer that there is so much data and information out there that's available for young students, and it takes a teacher to start to learn how to convene some of these different entities, how to bring data together, and how to bring learning facilities together in a whole new way. And so teachers will have to be retrained and learn new ways, I guess, of interacting with technology. And finally, for the students themselves, we will have to find a way as a country, both the private sector and the government, to put the necessary tools for people to be able to access information online. I don't think every school around the country still has computers and internet connections. It's our duty to continue finding ways to do it. I think there are many initiatives. Many years ago, more than 15 years ago, I led a consortium of individuals in the Philippines before PDRF was formed to try to get computers in every single public high school in the country. We succeeded up to about 60%. Then the government took over. We have to do the same thing now with internet connection. There is so much that can happen on that front, but I think all of us have a role to make that infrastructure happen, give the tools to students, find ways of funding access to these tools, and of course then have be engaged with the teachers and show them that there is a role for them in this new online world. If we're able to do that and tackle all those things jointly between the private and the public sector, then I think we can achieve a lot. But it's absolutely necessary, and I think this crisis has brought that very much to the front line.
Well, I'm delighted to be proved wrong, Jaime, and you're quite right. I mean, a huge amount has happened, and yet perhaps still a huge amount needs to happen. But with the track record that you have there, I feel certain that huge advances will be made. Colleagues, I think we've got about 8 minutes left. I'd like, if I could, to ask you a question which is to each of you, and let's start in reverse. Also, Jaime, please.
Sure.
What is your call to action for the private sector community as we anticipate responding to natural disasters during COVID-19? And I mean that in a global sense, because whilst the PDRF is an enormously advanced network, it is one of relatively few. So what would your call to action be to the private sector community in anticipating and responding to natural disasters and COVID-19?
Yeah, well, I think maybe just two thoughts on that front, Sebastian. Number one, I think it goes back to a theme that the three of us have touched on here today, which is I've always been a great believer in unity of action in addressing social development needs. I think there is a role, and I think Yusek Halad has been very eloquent in explaining it, so has Veron. There's so much to be gained by all of us working together, but that's not a natural skill set, Sebastian, that gets taught in our education, in our lives. Many of us are taught in the private sector that you build up skills in the business sector to compete, to work on your own, to build competitive advantage. Same thing for countries. Leaders are taught, how do you gain a competitive advantage over others? How do you succeed? There's going to be a whole new other element, which is how do we cooperate? You know, it's not the natural skill that is taught. We're taught the skills of a much more competitive environment, yet there are problems in this world where we all have to come together. And I think the three of us here have enjoyed the fruits of that and how positive that can be. I think a call to action will be a need for much more public-private engagement and really fundamentally building the tools at the educational level and at the professional level, that this is an important way to go and build levels of trust at different levels. PDRF is just one level, where we learn to understand each other's needs and work together. So that would be one call to action, I think, a need to convene and to work together more often than we have in the past. The second one, and I think Yusek Halad mentioned it, and I think it hasn't been discussed at this forum, is the importance of data and information. I think we have to have a scientific approach to addressing problems. Yusek Halad mentioned that data has been so important in being able to make fundamentally important decisions during this health crisis. If we don't have data, if we don't understand how many people are getting sick, how they're getting sick, where they're getting sick, how are we going to make decent decisions on what resources are needed? And so I'd like to put as a second call to action an engagement on all our parts to find better ways to use information and data constructively and in ways that can be shared with many others, and use the technology that exists today in so many fundamentally new ways to be able to achieve that. That would be, I guess, my second key point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm really indebted to you, and I think there's just a comment thanking you for your empathetic and empowering answer, and I'd mirror that. Thank you very much indeed, Jaime. I realized I was looking at the wrong clock and that we have 3 minutes left. So Veron, very briefly, please.
Yes. Well, preparation is key, and there are strategies that we can adopt to mitigate this, what we call double whammy. First is identify your worst case scenario. Second is review and modify your emergency response plan to include the minimum health standards, focusing on social distancing, be it in providing shelter or distributing aid. And for the business sector, continuation of their businesses. It's important for businesses to remain in operation to provide essential services. And third is risk communication. This pandemic really threw us in the dark at the start. And there is a mad scramble for information to understand what is happening to us. In PDRF, we conducted the webinars, shared official guidelines and technical reports to aid our stakeholders, our partners, for what is official and official information, and differentiate it from fake news. But I think more than that, there is a need for us to amplify stories of hope and the spirit of Filipino Bayanihan. So there is hope that we will overcome this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Veron. Yusek Khalad, you have approximately 30 seconds, sir. I apologize for the timing. I'm too ex-military and I like my timings.
Yeah, unity of action, as mentioned by Mr. Ayala, and I think that is depicted in the picture that I described to you, picture of group of people carrying a house to be transferred to another location, and unity of direction is important there. And we can achieve that through the coordination and collaboration platforms provided by our law, Republic Act 10121. The council, although PDRF is not a member, but lately we invite them to our meetings, and even in our planning meetings, whenever there is an approaching typhoon, the planning meetings that we call pre-disaster risk assessment meetings, we invite PDRF and all the other key actors, and so that's it. Coordination really is important so that we achieve the purpose and we attain unity of purpose.
Thank you very much indeed, Yusek Khalad. Colleagues online, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I'd like particularly to thank our panelists, who I thought spoke superbly. If you want to know more about the CBI team or the PDRF, please contact us. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank CBI supporters, including Boston Consulting Group, Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, the European Union Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid, ECHO, the UPS Foundation, the United Nations Global Compact, and the Office of US Foreign Disaster Assistance within the US Agency for International Development. We're hugely grateful for their support to ensure that we can continue our work. Jaime, Veron, Rick, thank you so much. Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.